The stage lights were on Clint Eastwood when he looked toward the back row, nodded his head slightly, and started walking. No one in the premiere knew where he was going, but everyone watched in silence. February 2006. Warner Brothers Studio Theater, Burbank, California. The premiere of Flags of Our Fathers. 300 invited guests filled the theater. Studio executives in the front rows. Cast and crew scattered throughout the middle sections. Press along the sides with cameras ready. The usual architecture of a Hollywood premiere, the important people close, everyone else arranged by hierarchy and access. Clint Eastwood stood at the podium on stage. Dark suit. No notes. Speaking in that familiar low rumble about the film, about Iwo Jima, about the men who fought there. His remarks were brief, as always. Clint never gave long speeches. He said what needed saying and sat down. He was maybe 2 minutes into his remarks when his eyes drifted toward the back of the theater. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. Not dramatically. Not with a gasp or a pause for effect. He simply stopped. His hand rested on the podium edge. His head tilted down slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, barely perceptible unless you were watching closely. And then he stepped away from the microphone. The theater held its breath. Clint walked to the edge of the stage, descended the 3 steps to the floor, and began walking up the center aisle. Slowly. Deliberately. His eyes fixed on the back row. No explanation. No announcement. Just movement. The audience turned in their seats, following his path, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Studio executives exchanged glances. The cast looked confused. Photographers lowered their cameras, uncertain whether to shoot or wait. Clint Eastwood kept walking. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. In the back row, far from the stage lights and the industry seats, sat an elderly man. 84 years old. Wearing an old suit that didn't quite fit anymore, the fabric worn at the elbows. His hands rested on a wooden cane. His face was weathered, deeply lined, the kind of face that had seen things most people only read about in history books. His name was James Bradley. Not the author James Bradley who wrote the book the film was based on. That James Bradley was sitting in the 5th row. This was a different man entirely. This was Corporal James Bradley. United States Marine Corps. Iwo Jima. February 1945. He had received an invitation to the premiere 3 weeks earlier. A form letter, really. The studio had sent invitations to surviving Iwo Jima veterans as a courtesy, expecting maybe a handful to attend. Most were in their 80s now. Most couldn't travel. Most had said their goodbyes to that island 60 years ago, and had no desire to watch it recreated on screen. But Corporal Bradley had come. He'd taken a bus from his home in Oxnard, California. 90 minutes each way. He'd arrived at the theater an hour early, and had been directed to the back row by an usher who didn't know who he was or why he mattered. "Is this seat okay, sir?" the usher had asked. "It's fine," Bradley had said. "I'm used to the back." He'd sat there through the pre-show music, through the celebrity arrivals he couldn't quite see from this distance, through the dimming of lights and the beginning of remarks. He hadn't expected to be recognized. He hadn't come for recognition. He'd come because 61 years ago, on a beach made of black volcanic sand, he had made a promise to men who didn't come home. And this film, even if it was just Hollywood's version, was about them. So he sat in the back row, hands on his cane, and waited. And then Clint Eastwood had looked up from his remarks, seen him, and started walking. The walk took maybe 45 seconds. It felt longer. 300 people in complete silence watching a 75-year-old director walk up the aisle of his own premiere. Clint reached the back row. He stopped in front of Corporal Bradley's seat. The old Marine looked up. Their eyes met. Clint extended his hand. "Corporal Bradley." It wasn't a question. Somehow he knew. Bradley took his hand. The handshake was firm despite the age in both men's grips. "Mr. Eastwood. When did you serve?" February through March 45. 3rd Marine Division. Clint nodded slowly. Iwo Jima. Yes, sir. You shouldn't be sitting back here. It's fine. I'm just... No, Clint said quietly. You shouldn't be sitting back here. Away from the cameras, Clint made a choice no one expected. Clint turned to face the theater. 300 people watching. Studio executives. Press. Cast members who had spent months portraying Marines but had never met one who was actually there. This is Corporal James Bradley, Clint said, his voice carrying through the theater without amplification, that low rumble filling the space. United States Marine Corps. He was at Iwo Jima. He was there. The theater began to understand. He's sitting in the back row, Clint continued. That's wrong. Clint looked at the front row, where studio executives sat in premium seats. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His eyes did the talking. One executive, a senior VP whose name nobody would remember after that night, stood up immediately. Please, he said, gesturing to his seat. Please. Another executive stood. Then another. Within 10 seconds, the entire front row had risen. Clint looked back at Corporal Bradley. Would you come sit down front, sir? Bradley's jaw tightened. His hands gripped his cane. Mr. Eastwood, I don't want to make a fuss. You're not making a fuss. You're accepting what you're owed. The old Marine's eyes glistened. He nodded once, a sharp military nod, and used his cane to push himself to standing. Clint offered his arm. Bradley took it. They walked down the aisle together. Slowly. The director and the corporal. Past rows of people who stood as they passed, not in rehearsed unison, but in spreading waves of recognition and respect. By the time they reached the front, the entire theater was on its feet. Clint guided Bradley to the center seat of the front row. The best seat in the house. The seat usually reserved for the biggest star or the most important executive. Bradley sat down carefully, his cane resting against the armrest. Clint didn't return to the podium. He sat down next to him. For 5 full seconds, no one moved. The theater stood in silence. The photographers didn't take pictures. The executives didn't sit back down. Everyone understood they were witnessing something that transcended the usual premiere politics. Finally, someone in the middle rows began to applaud. Not the quick, loud applause of entertainment. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of applause that carries weight. The entire theater joined. 300 people applauding a man most of them hadn't known was in the room 5 minutes ago. Clint didn't applaud. He sat beside Bradley, hands folded in his lap, eyes forward. When the applause finally faded, Clint stood and returned to the podium. He didn't reference what had just happened. He simply finished his remarks, another 30 seconds about the film and the men who inspired it, and introduced the screening. The lights went down. The film began. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. 90 minutes into the film, during the Iwo Jima battle sequence, Corporal Bradley closed his eyes. Clint noticed. He leaned over quietly. You okay? Bradley opened his eyes. The sound is very accurate. The shells. That's what it sounded like. Clint nodded. We worked hard on that. You got it right. They sat in silence for a moment. On screen, Marines were dying on black sand. I lost my best friend there, Bradley said quietly. February 23rd. He was 19. Clint didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. What was his name? Robert Chin. We called him Bobby. He was from San Francisco. Wanted to be an architect. Bobby Chin, Clint repeated, committing it to memory. He's not in your movie, Bradley said. He wasn't famous. He wasn't at the flag raising. He just fought and died like 10,000 other boys nobody remembers. I remember now, Clint said. After the film ended, after the lights came up, after the applause and the standing ovation and the studio executives rushing to congratulate Clint on another masterpiece, Corporal Bradley sat in his front row seat, hands on his cane, letting the crowd filter out. Clint stayed with him. "Thank you for coming," Clint said. "I know it wasn't easy. I promised them I'd remember. Seemed like watching this was part of that." Clint reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. He took out a pen and wrote something on the back. "This is my personal number," he said, handing it to Bradley. "If you ever want to tell me more about Bobby Chin, or anyone else, I want to hear it." Bradley looked at the card. "You don't have to do that. I know. But I want to." The old Marine tucked the card carefully into his shirt pocket. "Mr. Eastwood, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "When I got that invitation to this premiere, I almost didn't come. I thought, what's the point? Hollywood's going to make it all heroic and clean and nothing like what it really was. I thought it would just make me angry. And now?" Bradley's voice cracked slightly. "You moved me from the back row. Nobody's ever done that. Nobody's ever seen me." Clint's jaw tightened. He put his hand on the old Marine's shoulder. "You were never in the back row, Corporal. We just had you sitting in the wrong seat. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it. Forever." Corporal James Bradley died in 2011 at the age of 89. In his personal effects, his daughter found a business card with Clint Eastwood's phone number on the back. Below the number, Clint had written, "Bobby Chin, San Francisco. Age 19. Iwo Jima. Remembered." Bradley had called that number exactly once, 3 months after the premiere. He and Clint had spoken for 2 hours. Bradley told him about Bobby Chin. About their training together. About the jokes Bobby used to make. About the last thing Bobby said before the shell hit. Clint listened to all of it. When Letters from Iwo Jima premiered later that year, the companion film showing the Japanese perspective, Clint made sure Corporal Bradley was invited again. This time, the invitation wasn't a form letter. And this time, the front row seat was reserved before Bradley even arrived. At that premiere, Clint introduced him from the stage. Not as Corporal Bradley. As my friend Jim. And when Jim stood, the applause lasted longer than Clint's entire speech. After the screening, Jim approached Clint privately. "I've been carrying something for 61 years, he said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small, worn photograph, 5 young Marines in combat gear, smiling despite everything. "That's Bobby. Second from the left." Clint studied the photo carefully. "May I keep this? I'll have it preserved and returned to you." "Keep it," Jim said. "Bobby would want someone to remember what we looked like before the island." Clint had the photograph professionally archived. He kept a copy in his office, mounted in a simple frame. No plaque. No explanation. Just 5 faces that never grew old. In the years that followed, Clint's films carried a different weight. Gran Torino, American Sniper. Sully, stories about veterans, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about the ones who serve while others forget. People asked him why he kept making these films. Why he kept telling these stories when Hollywood wanted superheroes and franchises. Clint never explained directly. But those who knew him understood. He'd made a promise to a man he moved from the back row. A promise to keep remembering Bobby Chin and the thousands like him. Not with speeches or grand gestures. With work. With silence. With respect. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Corporal James Bradley was buried with full military honors in 2011. Clint Eastwood attended the funeral. He didn't speak. He stood in the back, away from the family, and watched as they lowered a Marine into the ground. Before he left, he placed something on the casket. A small card with 2 words written in his handwriting. Bobby remembered. That's the kind of man Clint Eastwood is. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't make speeches. He moves people from the back row. And he keeps his promises.